The auction yard was alive with the clamor of a town that thrived on spectacle. Dust rose in swirls from the hooves of restless horses, and the scent of hay and sweat hung heavy in the dry air. Merchants shouted over one another, peddling tools and provisions while families jostled for a good view of the main event. Magnolia Voss stood near the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the wooden platform ahead of her seeming impossibly high. She could feel the weight of every eye in the town pressed upon her, evaluating, judging, reducing her to a curiosity, a commodity to be bought and bartered. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and let the murmurs wash over her like a tide she had learned to navigate long ago. She was strong, yes, and aware of it, muscles honed from years of labor, but that strength had rarely earned admiration outside the kitchen and the back pasture where her work spoke for itself. Here in the center of town, strength was secondary to size, beauty and social pliability, and she knew it. The crowd shifted as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the yard, rattling off names and numbers, the sound slicing through the heat like a whip. Some women went up with trembling smiles, their worth measured in whispers about the curve of an arm, the tilt of a shoulder, the presumed docility of their temperament. Magnolia's gaze swept past them, taking in the familiar faces of the town, the sneers, the raised eyebrows, the quick calculations of families who thought themselves shrewd. And then there was the stagecoach driver, leaning against his battered vehicle at the far end of the yard. His coat was dusty, his hands roughened by miles on the road, yet his eyes were sharp, tracking Magnolia with quiet, unassuming interest. He had seen towns like this before, men and women reduced to commodities by fear, by expectation, by the weight of conformity. He watched her not with judgment, but with the curiosity of someone who understood that appearances could be deceiving. The platform creaked as Magnolia stepped up, each movement deliberate, each step a statement of presence. The murmurs swelled, a low wave of disbelief and amusement. The crowd expected her to falter, expected the usual commentary about size and suitability. Instead, she stood firm, her gaze sweeping the faces that tried to pin her down with prejudice. The sun glinted off her hair, and for a fleeting moment the world seemed to pause, waiting. Then a voice cut through the chatter like a thunderclap. $100. Sterling Maddox's bid rang across the yard. The crowd froze, jaws slack, eyes wide. $100, more than most families earned in half a year, thrown down without hesitation as if the man understood, truly understood what he was valuing. Magnolia's heart hammered in her chest, not from fear, but from a strange, dizzying recognition. Someone saw her, not as an object, not as a challenge to laugh at, but as a person of worth, as a force of skill and character. The auctioneer stammered, the murmurs rising to a roar. Did he just say $100? For her? Voices collided, disbelief and ridicule mixing into a palpable tension. Magnolia felt eyes burning into her, some with envy, some with outrage. And yet through the sea of faces, Sterling's gaze met hers, steady, unwavering, free of pity, free of condescension. The world around her buzzed and shook with shock and judgment. But in that gaze, Magnolia found a strange, piercing clarity. For the first time in memory, the measure of her life wasn't dictated by others' approval. She felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, the thrill of being truly seen. The bus driver shifted, adjusting his stance as he continued to watch quietly, a small knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had witnessed the beginnings of something extraordinary, something that could unsettle the rigid town and perhaps, in time, change the way they measured value. Dust and whispers swirled around Magnolia, but beneath them she stood taller, her pulse steady with a confidence she had never known could feel so exhilarating. The auction shock had passed, and in its wake, a new kind of possibility shimmered in the summer air. The murmurs of the crowd didn't die down. They swelled into a low roar, like the growl of distant thunder rolling across the grasslands. Magnolia's pulse pounded in her ears, but it wasn't fear that gripped her. It was disbelief, awe, and something far older, far more profound, recognition. Sterling Maddox hadn't bid $100 out of spectacle or arrogance. His gaze, calm and unwavering, held a certainty she hadn't encountered in her 26 years of scraping by in kitchens and back alleys. For the first time, someone measured her by what she could do, not by how she looked, not by how her curves unsettled the fragile eyes of small-town judgment. The auctioneer's voice trembled as he tried to regain control of the yard. The bid is final. $100 for Miss Voss. His words barely cut through the tidal wave of whispers and gasps. Families nudged each other, the elder women fanning themselves with theatrical indignation. "That man's lost his mind," someone shouted. Clyde Hargrove, Magnolia's so-called employer, stepped forward, his black hat tilted at an angle meant to convey authority. "Now hold on, Maddox," he barked. "This isn't how things are done. You can't just—" Sterling cut him off with the precision of a blade. "I can," he said simply, his voice carrying across the yard. It wasn't anger exactly. It was certainty, and it carried weight. "And I just did." The platform creaked beneath Magnolia as she shifted her weight, the crowd's scrutiny heavy, suffocating. She wanted to step down, to retreat, to disappear behind the familiar veil of invisibility that had protected her all these years. But something in Sterling's eyes anchored her, a tether of possibility that whispered she could stand. She straightened, lifted her chin, and let herself be seen. You bid $100, she said finally, her voice low, cautious, incredulous. "For me?" Sterling's mouth curved in the barest hint of a smile, but there was no mockery in it. "Not for you. For what you can do, for what you're worth." He paused, letting the words hang in the thick air, heavy with expectation. "And I intend to give you the chance to prove it." The crowd erupted. A woman offered partnership? A woman commanded wages? The very notion shattered the careful balance of their world. "Partnership?" whispered Martha Whitley, her fan fluttering. "Surely he doesn't mean it." Clyde's jaw tightened. "Partnership is not for women like her." His voice cracked as if the words themselves betrayed his uncertainty. Sterling's gaze never left Magnolia. "Partnership is exactly for women like her," he said, and the clarity in his tone silenced the murmurs. "For those who are judged by size, by curves, by society's shallow measures, and yet have strength, skill, and character that can't be quantified on scales or in whispers." The bus driver, leaning against his coach at the edge of the yard, shifted slightly, the corners of his mouth tilting upward. He had seen many towns, many auctions, many haggles over cattle and tools, but rarely had he witnessed something like this. Rarely had he seen a man challenge not just the marketplace, but the very heart of a community's prejudices. Magnolia swallowed hard. The world seemed to tilt on an unfamiliar axis. For decades she had carried the weight of expectation, the sneers, the criticisms, the constant reminder that her worth was dictated by others' fragile definitions of beauty. And now here stood a man who offered something she had never been given. Choice. Choice, she whispered almost to herself. Her chest tightened at the word. I've never had that." "You do now," Sterling said, his voice calm, unwavering. "The choice is yours, Magnolia Voss, to step into what you've always been capable of, or to step back into what they think you should be." Clyde's face twisted with fury. "Maddox, you'll regret this. You don't know what you're dealing with." Sterling didn't flinch. "I do, and I'm willing to pay the price for doing what's right." Magnolia's heart raced, a strange mix of fear, exhilaration, and fierce pride. She glanced at the crowd, noting the shifting expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, envy. And then she looked at Sterling, and in that steady gaze she felt the spark of her own power ignite. She realized that the story of her life was no longer being written by others' expectations. She could take the pen. She could write her own chapter. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her hand. "I accept," she said. The words trembled at first, then rang clear and firm across the auction yard. "I accept your offer, Mr. Maddox." The yard fell into stunned silence. Even the bus driver straightened slightly, his sharp eyes gleaming with quiet admiration. Somewhere deep in the crowd, whispers began to shift from ridicule to cautious respect, as though the air itself sensed that a storm had begun, and it was one that would change everything. The stagecoach wheels rattled across the dusty road, a steady clatter that seemed almost to echo Magnolia's heartbeat. The town had receded behind them, its shouts and whispers reduced to a faint hum on the horizon. She sat stiffly beside Sterling Maddox, her fingers pressed into the worn leather of the seat, yet she could not stop herself from stealing glances at him. He drove with a quiet authority, his gaze scanning the open land ahead, but every so often, his eyes flicked to her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something far more unsettling and rare: understanding. Magnolia's mind refused to stay quiet. Memories of Clyde's sneers, of being reduced to broken dishes and frayed linens, of whispered commentary about her weight and her unladylike stature. They clawed at her, each one demanding acknowledgment. And yet there was something in Sterling's presence that made those old fears seem smaller, almost petty. He had seen her strength without needing it to be demonstrated through spectacle. He had seen her worth without the yard, without the town, without the gossip. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the stagecoach driver who had brought them this far, leaning on the door. A silent observer who had slipped into their path with uncanny timing. His sharp eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat, but they followed her like a hawk. She caught the faintest smirk tug at the corner of his mouth as he studied the tension in her shoulders. He had traveled miles of frontier roads, seen towns rise and fall, seen lives crushed by expectation and propriety, and now he watched her, the woman who dared to refuse invisibility. There was an air of quiet calculation about him, the sense of a mind always several moves ahead, gauging the storm that had begun in that auction yard. The land unfolded like a living painting. Rolling hills dappled with gold grass, distant mountains rising like guardians on the horizon, and the occasional silhouette of a lone rider tracing paths Magnolia could only imagine. She breathed it in, letting the rhythm of the stagecoach and the endless sky soothe her frayed nerves. And yet the unease lingered. She had accepted the offer, yes, but acceptance was not the same as certainty. Questions gnawed at her like persistent mice. What exactly was this partnership? What would be expected of her? And, most unsettling of all, why did Sterling Maddox choose her of all people? You didn't have to bid that much, she said at last, her voice breaking the silence. The words sounded smaller than she intended. $50 would have shocked them just as thoroughly. Sterling's hands tightened briefly on the reins. I didn't bid to shock them, he said, his voice low, deliberate. I bid what I thought you were worth. Worth. The words struck her like lightning. Not a wage, not charity, not some cruel calculation of labor and hours, but worth. He saw her as a person, not a number, not a curiosity, not a problem to be solved. And in that recognition, something inside her shifted. Pride, long dormant, surged in a tide that left her breathless and trembling. She met his gaze, defiance sparking in her eyes despite the nervousness that still clung to her. You don't know anything about me, she said, almost a challenge. For all you know, I'm lazy, dishonest, or completely incompetent. Sterling was quiet for a moment, the stagecoach rattling over uneven ground, dust rising in tiny spirals around the wheels. No, he said finally, his tone steady. I've been watching you, Magnolia. Not in any improper way, but I've seen how you carry yourself, how you work. I've seen you repair what others thought irreparable, calm what others deemed uncontrollable. Strength isn't just in muscle, it's in character. And you have that. The words sank in, heavy and unyielding. She had spent years invisible, scraping by, enduring remarks about her size, her ambition, her refusal to bow. And now, in the span of a single afternoon, someone had not only acknowledged her but elevated her. They rode on, silence stretching between them like a living thing, until the outline of a ranch appeared on the horizon. Buildings clustered together with purposeful modesty, a main house with a wide porch, barn solid and well kept. Sterling pointed toward them, his expression unreadable. It's not fancy, he said, but it's honest work. In a place where worth is measured by what you contribute, not how you look. Magnolia's chest tightened. A mixture of relief, anticipation, and a flicker of fear she refused to name. This was no longer a town, no longer an auction yard. This was uncharted territory, a place where she could define herself, not by gossip, not by fear, not by shallow judgment. She had stepped off the platform, and now the horizon stretched before her, vast and endless, daring her to take the first step into something real. And in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that the storm from the auction yard had not ended. It was only beginning, and it was coming for more than just her pride. The first morning at Sterling Maddox's ranch broke with a chill that bit at the edges of Magnolia's confidence, as if the land itself were testing her resolve. Mist clung to the rolling pastures, curling around fence posts and grazing cattle like a shroud, and the distant mountains were veiled in ghostly gray. Magnolia swung her legs over the side of the bunkhouse porch, the coarse wood rough against her palms, and inhaled the scent of hay, leather, and earth. This was no town kitchen, no backroom chores. The ranch demanded more. It demanded grit, intelligence, and the kind of endurance that went far beyond physical labor. And she intended to prove she had it. Sterling was already outside, inspecting the herd with methodical patience. His presence was quiet but commanding, like a river flowing steady through rock-strewn terrain. When he saw Magnolia descending the porch steps, he gave a simple nod. No fanfare, no hollow encouragement, just acknowledgment of her arrival into the place she had chosen. She returned the nod with a straightening of her shoulders, feeling the weight of his gaze like a mantle she was ready to carry. The day's tasks began with the livestock. One of the younger stallions, a dark bay colt, had taken a habit of bolting when the herd moved. Other hands had tried and failed to tame him, leaving scratches on their arms and bruises on their pride. Magnolia approached cautiously, studying the animal's movements, noting the tense flick of ears, the rigid shift of weight. She spoke softly, words low and steady, her hands moving with confidence. The colt flinched at first, but she persisted, unyielding and calm. By the time the sun had climbed toward midday, the colt was following her with a careful, cautious trust, a feat the ranch hands had sworn impossible. Watching from a distance, Sterling's eyes narrowed with approval. "You see things differently," he said quietly, as if speaking aloud confirmed a truth. "You don't try to force control. You earn it." Magnolia felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper, something she hadn't felt in years. Validation. Not charity, not pity, not even admiration built from spectacle, but respect earned from skill and perseverance. By afternoon, she was repairing a broken wagon wheel, the timber stubborn and unyielding under her calloused hands. The others had thrown their shoulders against it, swearing at its resistance, but she approached it with patience and observation. She noted the grain, the imperfections, the points of tension. With a measured rhythm, she levered it free and set it back in place, the wheel secure and ready for miles of travel. Sterling had said nothing during the process, and yet she felt his gaze like sunlight, warm, unflinching, acknowledging her capability without diminishing it. The bus driver, who had become a silent observer on previous days, reappeared in the distance, pausing to watch her work. He leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He had seen many women perform labor, many men claim authority, and yet Magnolia moved through her tasks with a quiet mastery that unsettled conventional expectations. He did not intervene. He merely watched. By evening, exhaustion began to gnaw at her muscles and her resolve. Sweat streaked her face, her palms were blistered, and yet a fire burned inside her chest. This was no simple acceptance of labor. This was proving that her worth was measured by action, by intelligence, by character, and that for the first time in her life, she could be seen and judged on her terms. Sterling approached as the sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the pasture. "You're doing well," he said simply, though the weight behind the words was unmistakable. "More than well. You're reshaping how this place functions, and perhaps even how others will see it." Magnolia looked toward the horizon, her body trembling from effort and exhilaration alike. She realized in that moment that the real challenge was not just the work itself. The real test was the town, the whispers, the unseen eyes that would follow her every move, waiting for misstep or failure. She had begun to change her own destiny, yes, but now she would have to change theirs too. And somewhere at the edge of the pasture, beyond the reach of the setting sun, she glimpsed Clyde's black hat appearing on the horizon, dust rising like a harbinger. He was coming. He had not forgotten, and he had not forgiven. The fire inside Magnolia did not waver. She wiped the sweat from her brow, flexed her aching hands, and stood taller than she ever had before. She would meet whatever storm was coming, not as a victim but as a force, unyielding, capable, and recognized at last for the full measure of her strength. The town of Red Willow seemed smaller from the saddle than it had from the auction yard, yet the weight of every eye, every whispered judgment, pressed upon Magnolia as if the streets themselves remembered her as the curiosity she had been days before. Dust churned under the hooves of Sterling's horse, and Magnolia's heart beat in rhythm with the thudding sound. They rode through the main street not as subdued citizens, but as heralds of something new, a challenge to the invisible chains that had kept women measured by curves, compliance, and silent endurance. By the time they reached the central square, a small crowd had gathered. Clyde Hargrove, his black hat tilted like a crown of fury, stomped toward them with Tom Bradley and Frank Delaney in tow. The trio's expressions were taut with indignation and barely restrained malice, a living embodiment of the town's fragile order. Magnolia's stomach tightened, but she straightened her back, feeling the muscles in her shoulders tense like steel springs. She would not shrink. Sterling Maddox, Clyde bellowed, pointing a shaking finger. You think you can just take what's mine? That woman owes me. Everything she's ever broken, every meal she's spoiled, every penny you've paid in wages. His voice carried across the square, a whip crack against the afternoon heat. Sterling dismounted, his posture steady, every movement deliberate, a living argument against the chaos Clyde sought to impose. Let me see that list, he said quietly, almost too quietly. Yet the crowd fell into a hushed tension, waiting for confrontation to bloom. Clyde handed over the crumpled paper, trembling as if it contained some talisman of power. Sterling read it, the sun catching the sharp edge of his gaze as he spoke aloud the charges. 12 broken plates at $3 each. Torn bedsheet $5. Spoiled roast $10. He looked up, his voice calm but carrying the weight of judgment. Clyde, you don't charge your paying customers $3 for plates. And this beef roast supposedly spoiled? I saw you serving it on July 16th. Same roast. This is not debt. This is fraud. A murmur ran through the crowd. Magnolia's pulse thrummed in her ears, not from fear, but from the intoxicating rush of power that came from truth spoken aloud. Clyde's face flushed crimson. His authority, the brittle construct he had built, cracked in plain sight. Tom Bradley spat into the dirt, his sneer faltering under Sterling's quiet but unyielding logic. You think she owes you nothing? Bradley jeered. She owes you honesty, Sterling corrected, his eyes unwavering. Not subservience. Not your idea of propriety. She owes only what she earns with skill, courage, and character. And she has paid in full. Magnolia's gaze swept the crowd, seeing familiar faces twist with disbelief. Some women's eyes were wide with awe, a spark of possibility igniting where fear had ruled before. Others averted their eyes, struggling to reconcile centuries of unspoken expectation with the reality of a woman standing resolute, defended by a man who saw her worth as clearly as she now did herself. You think this ends with money? Clyde's voice hissed, a snake coiled tight with rage. You're causing trouble, Maddox.
She'll bring nothing but trouble.
Magnolia stepped forward, her voice carrying over the rising tension, strong and steady. This wasn't about debt or broken dishes. It was about control. About how your town has measured women for generations. Not by skill, not by courage, not by character, but by fear and expectation. And I will not be measured that way. A hush fell. Even the men who had shouted and sneered felt the weight of her words, heavy and undeniable. Sterling moved beside her, placing a protective hand near hers, a silent promise of solidarity but not dominance. He was there to witness her strength, not claim it. From the edge of the square, the bus driver watched, leaning against the post of a shuttered shop. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculating as if the threads of the town, Sterling, Magnolia, and even Clyde were part of some larger tapestry he understood. He did not intervene, but he noted every word, every tremor of tension, and the way Magnolia's presence had already begun to ripple outward, challenging what others had long accepted as immutable. Clyde sputtered, his words failing him, the town council's delicate veneer cracking under the weight of truth and courage. Magnolia felt a heat rise in her chest, not from exertion but from something deeper, a sense of purpose crystallizing. She was no longer a figure to be whispered about, laughed at, or feared in silence. She was a force, and the town would either reckon with that truth or be swept aside by it. As the sun began to dip behind the western hills, shadows stretching long and thin across the square, Magnolia knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was not with Clyde, nor with the men who whispered judgments from the corners. It was with every expectation, every invisible chain that had tried to define her, and she was ready. The days after the confrontation in the square were heavy with murmurs that followed Magnolia wherever she went. Red Willow, a town long accustomed to women measured by smiles and silence, had begun to shift, and the ripple of change was impossible to ignore. Doors that had always opened with polite indifference now creaked with hesitant curiosity. Shopkeepers glanced at her with a mixture of awe and thinly veiled fear. Young women lingered in doorways, catching her eye and daring for the first time to imagine a life not defined by marriage or subservience. Magnolia moved through it all with a quiet intensity, each step deliberate, each gesture a claim on her own power. On the ranch, Sterling's gaze followed her with unwavering attention, not as a master measuring progress, but as a partner observing mastery. They worked side by side, tending to cattle, mending fences, and managing the endless demands of life in the wide-open expanse of the frontier. The sweat on her brow was mingled with pride, her hands blistered, her muscles aching, yet the exhaustion was drowned beneath a flood of accomplishment. She was no longer simply surviving. She was shaping, commanding, redefining, but the town's resistance simmered beneath polite civility. Clyde Hargrove had returned to the shadows, muttering threats with venom beneath his breath, rallying those who feared the world shifting beneath their feet. Tom Bradley whispered in corners, fanning sparks of doubt among the older generation, and even those who had once ignored her watched with wary suspicion. Each day Magnolia's competence became more visible, and each day the ripples of her influence spread further, threatening the fragile structures of tradition that had held the town in stasis for generations. In the evenings, she would ride across the open pastures alone, letting the wind whip through her hair, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. It was there, in the isolation of the grasslands, that the magnitude of her impact settled over her. Young girls in town, emboldened by her defiance, were beginning to ask questions about work, wages, and independence. Mothers, unsure and frightened, whispered caution, but could not erase the spark she had lit. Every small act of courage, every solved problem on the ranch, every decision made without fear of judgment, became a lesson whispered across Red Willow streets. Sterling rode alongside her during one of these evening inspections, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "They don't know how to handle you," he said, voice low, thoughtful, almost reverent. "They've never encountered someone who refuses to be measured by their expectations." "I know," Magnolia replied, tightening her grip on the reins. "And I don't care if they never understand. This isn't about them, it's about me, about what I can do, what I can become." Yet even as she spoke the words, a shadow of doubt lingered. Clyde was not finished. His plans, his threats simmered unseen. One day she spotted his black hat glinting in the distance, Tom Bradley sneering beside him, and Frank Delaney's cautious, calculating eyes scanning the ranch. They came not for cattle, not for property, but for control, the invisible chains of societal order they had clung to for decades. And Magnolia, standing amidst the open land and endless sky, understood that the confrontation she had faced in the square was only a prelude to the battle yet to come. Word of her influence reached beyond the town as well. Travelers, merchants, even the stagecoach driver who had first observed her at the auction, whispered of the woman who had reshaped a town's perception by sheer force of character. Her reputation stretched like wildfire across the frontier, drawing eyes, stirring curiosity, and most importantly, inviting scrutiny. One evening, as Magnolia repaired a section of fence with Sterling nearby, a faint dust cloud appeared on the horizon. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, her heart tightening with instinctive awareness. This was no casual visitor. The wind carried the distant sound of hooves, steady and purposeful, and even Sterling's jaw set in recognition of the approaching threat. "They're coming," he said softly, though the weight of it hung heavy in the air. "Clyde and his allies won't let this stand quietly. They'll do whatever it takes to undermine you, to prove that women like you, strong, capable, defiant, shouldn't exist in their world." Magnolia's chest rose and fell, a slow, steady rhythm of resolve. The ripple of change had already begun. It could not be stopped. The storm on the horizon would come, yes, but she would meet it, not as a victim, not as a curiosity, but as a force that could no longer be ignored. Every step she had taken, every challenge she had faced had led to this moment, and she was ready. Even in the fading light, with shadows stretching long across the rolling pastures, Magnolia realized that her journey was no longer her own alone. She carried with her the hopes of young women who dared to dream, the quiet admiration of those who had watched silently, and the unwavering support of a man who had chosen to see her true worth. The battle ahead would test every ounce of courage, every measure of skill and intellect she possessed, but it would not break her. Somewhere beyond the horizon the storm gathered, dark and inevitable, and Magnolia, standing tall with hands calloused, gaze steady and heart fierce, knew that when it came, she would meet it on her own terms, and that the world would never be the same. The town council had convened in the old church basement, a space that had long been neutral yet carried the weight of generations of judgment. The low beams groaned under the weight of the afternoon sun, dust motes floating in the shafts of light like tiny witnesses to the storm about to break. Magnolia sat beside Sterling Maddox, her hands folded in her lap, fingers still streaked with dirt from the morning's labor. She felt the eyes of the town's leaders on her, some curious, some incredulous, others burning with barely concealed ire. Mayor Harrison called the meeting to order with all the pomp of authority, though his voice trembled slightly, as if even he sensed the instability beneath the veneer of propriety. "We are gathered," he began, "to discuss the moral standards of our community and certain influences that threaten our way of life." Martha Whitley, her fan trembling in her hands, rose immediately. "That woman," she pointed at Magnolia, "has been filling our daughters' heads with dangerous notions." Magnolia's pulse quickened. Dangerous notions such as independence, such as questioning authority, such as refusing to be reduced to a size or a role, had never been so audibly condemned. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I have never told anyone not to marry," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I have only shown that a woman can choose what she wants to do with her life, that she can work, learn, and make her own decisions without fear of shame." A murmur ran through the council, some shifting uncomfortably, others stiffening in defiance. Tom Bradley scoffed. "Women don't understand cattle," he barked, trying to reclaim authority. Magnolia's eyes did not leave his. "Perhaps you underestimate us," she said. "I have rotated pastures, managed livestock, repaired broken equipment, and increased productivity by 20% in 3 weeks. All of this because I was allowed to act, to contribute, and to think for myself, not because I fit your idea of a woman." The room went quiet, the weight of her words settling like dust in the stale air. Then from the doorway a figure emerged, a man older than most of the council, leaning on a walking stick, eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. The room instinctively fell silent. This was Doc Patterson, a physician whose reputation for integrity and insight had long outshone any position of official authority. "Mr. Mayor," Doc Patterson began, voice steady, "I have heard this town condemn choices without understanding consequences. Let me remind you of young Sarah Mitchell. She refused a marriage proposal, and I discovered that had she married, her life and her health would have been at great risk. Miss Voss's example has already saved a life by showing that a woman can choose wisely, thoughtfully, and independently." Shock rippled through the council. The room's fragile structure of tradition trembled under the weight of truth. Even the mayor's face paled, his mouth opening, closing, searching for an argument that could withstand the undeniable. And then, from the shadows beyond the doorway, a faint chuckle echoed. The council turned as a figure stepped into the light, a man with a weathered hat, dust-streaked coat, and a presence that commanded attention without a word. The bus driver, who had silently observed Magnolia's journey from the auction yard to this very moment, revealed himself fully. "I've watched this town," he said, voice low but cutting through the tension like steel. "I've seen how women are measured by fear and expectation, how men cling to control disguised as propriety. And I've seen Miss Magnolia Voss." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the council absorb the full weight of his gaze. "She is exactly the leader, the force, the mind I've been searching for. This town has judged her, underestimated her, tried to confine her. I am here to correct that mistake." A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. Eyes widened, jaws slackened. The man who had been a quiet observer, who had appeared at the auction and along the frontier roads, was no ordinary traveler. He was a rancher and investor of considerable means, scouting for someone capable of overseeing operations across the territory. And he had chosen Magnolia. Sterling's hand found Magnolia's, squeezing it lightly, but not to claim her victory, only to honor it. She felt heat rise in her chest, a mixture of disbelief, pride, and a fierce exhilaration. All her efforts, all her struggles, all the whispers and sneers of the town had led to this moment. The council's authority, long assumed unshakable, began to crumble under the magnitude of the revelation. Clyde Hargrove's black hat slipped slightly back, his face drained of color. Tom Bradley's sneer vanished, and even Mayor Harrison faltered, unable to respond. The power dynamics of the town had shifted in a single afternoon, and there was nothing they could do to reverse it. Magnolia stood, voice clear and commanding. "I have worked, I have earned, and I have chosen my path. I will continue to do so, not to shock, not to prove a point, but because my worth is my own, and no town, no council, no man can define it for me." The bus driver, revealed as her ally, Her patron, a man of vision, nodded in quiet approval. Sterling's presence beside her was steady and unwavering, and outside the basement the wind carried the murmurs of a town beginning to understand that the world had changed. Magnolia had not only survived, she had transformed the rules, challenged the expectations, and carved a space where strength, intelligence, and character mattered more than appearance or conformity. The shocking reveal was not just the identity of the observer. It was the truth that Magnolia herself had always carried. Finally recognized by the world, and in that moment, the frontier was hers not by inheritance, not by purchase, but by the undeniable force of her own worth.